If you're like me and pay attention to court cases in the news these days, you've probably heard about the Brady Rule. It may have been mentioned as a Brady violation, a Brady requirement, Brady material, or just simply referred to as Brady. Everyone seems to have a basic idea about what Brady is. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in a bit. But I started wondering, just a little curious, what's the story behind the case? Who is Brady? Why does Brady have a rule named after him? That's what this is about. Why is this such a big deal? Because it involves constitutional rights. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution provides that a right to due process is a basic right. The 14th Amendment provides that it applies to all citizens born or naturalized in the United States. Well, what is due process? It's a legal principle that requires the government to follow certain rules and procedures before taking away a person's life, liberty, or property. So how did Brady become a part of this? A landmark Supreme Court case? A rule that changed the way that prosecuting attorneys had to operate? The background reads a bit like a comedy of errors, a tragic comedy, because a man lost his life to precipitate the chain of events that led to the Supreme Court case. John Brady was 25 years old back in the late 50s. He had a girlfriend who happened to be married to someone else. She told John that she was pregnant and that she was sure he was the father. He didn't have a whole lot of prospects, as they say back in the day, but John wrote his girlfriend a check for $35,000. That was a large sum of money, and post-dated it for 2 weeks later. He told her not to cash it till that date, which she didn't wait, and then John set about making it good. John enlisted a friend, Donald Boblet, who happened to be the girlfriend's brother, and decided to rob a bank. They lived in the Baltimore area, but they didn't want to rob a bank there or in Washington because there would be too much of a police presence nearby. They decided on an area outside of Baltimore. To do this, they needed a reliable car. John had a car, but wasn't the type that would be able to outrun the police. John had a friend, however, an older gentleman who'd been kind to him when he was a teen, named William Brooks. Brooks had just purchased a Ford Fairlane, which was a very nice car. John had seen it, and he wanted it. John figured that he and Donald could borrow the car by carjacking Brooks after work and then returning the car after they performed the bank robbery. Brooks worked the late shift at a local plant and returned home late in the evening. John and Donald had set up a ruse to stop the car near the victim's home, tie him up, and steal the car. John had told Donald that Brooks was not to be hurt. Once the plan was in action, Brady stepped away for a moment after the victim was, they thought, secure. Brooks tried to get away or struggle with Boblet, who was concerned that Brooks had already seen him. Boblet wrapped his shirt around Brooks' neck and strangled him. The two decided they didn't want to go through with the bank robbery, but they felt like they needed to get out of town. They first headed west, planning to go to Washington State. John had lived there at some point earlier in his life. They didn't get too far until Boblet wanted to return home, so they parked the car in a small town, split the money they'd taken from Brooks' wallet, and purchased bus tickets back home. Brady heard from a family member that the police were looking for him. He panicked and decided to leave the country. He'd traveled to Cuba. He was planning to try and join Castro's forces. Once in Cuba, he realized he was being foolish. So he went to the U.S. Embassy and arranged to return to the state. Brady was unaware that Brooks' body had been found, and so when he returned to the States, the FBI was there waiting. He thought he could get away with confessing the car theft and that he would have time to escape before the body was discovered. Since the body had been discovered, Brady was arrested immediately. At trial, since Brady had confessed to being part of the robbery, that confession was admitted. The defense's argument focused on the guilt or innocence of committing the murder. Brady swore he didn't kill the victim, but rather Boblet did. Boblet, however, had been insisting it was the other way around. In fact, Boblet was there interrogated 5 times, and every time but the last, he said that Brady had committed the murder. In his last interview with the police, Boblet admitted he had killed Brooks. Boblet and Brady were tried separately. Brady's attorney requested all evidence against his client, including any statements given by Boblet. The prosecutor turned over everything except the last interview. Both Boblet and Brady were convicted in separate trials, and both were sentenced to death. Sometime later, a Catholic priest at the prison where Brady was incarcerated on death row helped Brady get a new attorney. That attorney reviewed Boblet's trial record as well and noted that Boblet had asserted his last statement was not true. The attorney realized that Boblet must have said something that admitted his role in the killing. That became the basis for Brady's appeal. The first appeal was unsuccessful, but on the second appeal, the Maryland Court of Appeals unanimously held that there was a duty on the state to produce the confession of Boblet that he did the actual strangling. Failure to produce the confession was a violation of Brady's constitutional right to due process of law. But not so fast. The relief was to remand Brady's case for a determination of the appropriate sentencing. Brady had confessed to being part of the crime and so was guilty of felony murder. The only issue was what type of punishment, death sentence or some level of incarceration. The Supreme Court appeal. When Brady wasn't granted a new trial on the basis of the appeal to the state of Maryland, the appeal was submitted to the Supreme Court, which accepted the case. Reading the court's decision, two questions were outlined. Did the prosecution's suppression of Boblet's confession deny Brady due process? And two, was the Maryland Court of Appeals wrong to remand only on the question of punishment? And the Supreme Court answered those questions. On the first question, yes, the suppression of Boblet's confession denied Brady due process. On the second question, the court agreed with the Maryland's Court of Appeals. No, the court was not wrong to remand only on the question of punishment. After all, he had confessed to being a participant. Now, one thing that's very cool about Supreme Court cases, they weren't and are not to this day televised, but many of the oral arguments are recorded and published. You can actually listen to them through the link provided in the notes below. That's specifically to the Brady case. The Brady court actually cited Mooney versus Holohan, a case that had taken place about 25 years prior, and where it said this: it is a requirement that cannot be deemed to be satisfied by mere notice and hearing if a state has contrived a conviction through the pretense of a trial which is, in truth, but used as a means of depriving a defendant of liberty through a deliberate deception of court and jury by the presentation of testimony known to be perjured. The Holohan case involved obtaining a criminal conviction by depending solely on perjured testimony known by the prosecution to be untrue. And so the rule became, in criminal prosecutions, the government must provide any information in its possession that could be exculpatory or helpful to the defendant's case, proving innocence or impact the judgment or sentence. The Brady Rule meant that the prosecution must turn information over to the defense if it is favorable to the accused, if it potentially reduces a defendant's sentence, if it calls a witness' credibility into question, or it would allow a jury to have a reasonable doubt or infer against the defendant's guilt. Another Supreme Court case, United States versus Bagley, followed Brady by about 2 decades. Bagley helped clarify the parameters of Brady. It involved federal charges related to narcotics and firearms law violations. Bagley was convicted on the narcotics charges, but not the firearms charges. 2 of the witnesses that testified against Bagley were informants paid by the ATF. Those payments were not disclosed to the defense during the initial trial. Several years later, Bagley obtained information related to his conviction under the Freedom of Information Act and discovered that the witnesses were paid informants. The lack of disclosure formed the basis for Bagley to appeal his conviction. In the Bagley decision, the Supreme Court clarified the prosecution's obligation. Prior to Bagley, if the defense didn't request all evidence, then the Brady Rule didn't apply. Bagley clarified the rule and placed responsibility on the prosecution to provide any such evidence they possessed or knew of. Brady disclosures became an affirmative obligation and didn't require action on the defense's part. Kyles versus Whitley came before the Supreme Court about 10 years after, and in 1995, it provided opportunity for further clarification or refinement of Brady. Kyles was alleged to have committed an armed robbery and carjacking, during which the victim was shot and killed. While there were multiple witnesses that identified Kyles as the carjacker and killer, one witness, nicknamed Beanie, seemed very aware of details of the crime. Information provided by Beanie led to a majority of the physical evidence. In addition to being an acquaintance of Kyles, Beanie was alleged to have a thing for Kyles' common-law wife and had been in Kyles' home between the time of the crime and Kyles' arrest. Beanie alleged that Kyles had sold him the victim's car for $400. He told police that he later discovered that the car was associated with the robbery and murder. Beanie then told the police where they could find other evidence that incriminated Kyles. The evidence included shopping bags and grocery items that were taken from the grocery store where the crime occurred and the handgun used in the carjacking. Those shopping bags were found outside Kyles' home and the murder weapon behind the stove in Kyles' kitchen. The police discovered not only grocery bags, but the victim's purse in one of the grocery bags. They also discovered the handgun where Beanie had described. On appeal, Kyles asserted that the state had withheld several pieces of evidence: transcript of police interviews with Beanie, a written statement signed by Beanie after one of the interviews, investigatory notes, and a list of license plate numbers from the cars parked at the grocery store the night of the robbery and murder had not been disclosed by the prosecution. The Supreme Court's ruling in Kyles provided that the defendant has to prove that withheld information is both material and favorable to the defense. It provided these guidelines. The defendant must prove reasonable probability that the failure to disclose undermines confidence in the trial's outcome. The withheld information can reasonably be taken to put the whole case in a different light. Failure to disclose this information has a reasonable probability of changing the outcome of the trial and is inherently harmful. And then, finally, all evidence not disclosed must be considered as a whole, not item by item. So what happens if the prosecution violates Brady obligations? It's up to the court, but it can include a variety of different remedies: exclusion of the evidence withheld, additional time for the defense to investigate or prepare and review that evidence, admission of defense evidence that was otherwise inadmissible, limiting instructions given to the jury, sanctions against the prosecution, or a mistrial if it's prior to final judgment, or conviction reversal if it's post-final judgment. Now, there have been several contemporary cases that have involved the Brady Rule and have brought it to the highlight, so to speak. State of New Mexico versus Alexander Baldwin, better known as Alec. Baldwin was charged with manslaughter murder based on the accidental shooting of Helena Hutchins, a member of the crew shooting a movie titled Rust. In this case, the special prosecutor made a determination that ammunition linked to the scene of the shooting was not relevant and so never disclosed it to the defense. Once the defense learned of the potentially exculpatory information, they successfully alleged a Brady violation on the prosecution's part. A mistrial with prejudice was declared by the court. This is an unusual case. The prosecution's case in chief had not yet started. They hadn't started testimony. But the court found that since a jury had been seated, the prosecution's failure was Brady violation that could have significantly impacted the view of the case, even the types of questions that the defense might have asked of potential jurors. Once a jury is seated, jeopardy attaches. To order a new trial would have placed Baldwin in double jeopardy, which is a constitutional violation. The omission was a Brady violation and was significant enough to grant the mistrial, and a mistrial with prejudice. Another recent case that has received national attention is State of Maryland versus Adnan Syed. Syed was the subject of a series on NPR called Serial. Sayed was convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. He spent about 20 years in prison before being granted a new trial due to Brady violations. These violations included failure to disclose an alibi witness that testified that Sayed was in the library at the time Lee was murdered, failure to disclose alternate suspects to the defense attorneys, and failure to disclose DNA results at the crime scene that excluded Sayed. Sayed's currently awaiting a new trial due to obligations the prosecution neglected to the victim's family under Maryland's victims' rights mandates. And a final contemporary example, the Young Thug RICO trial in Atlanta involves multiple defendants. The state of Georgia versus Adams, Arnold, Beebe, et al. Is the latest in a line of contemporary cases of note involving potential Brady violations. Potential Brady violations include an ex parte meeting in a judge's chamber between prosecution and a state's witness who had been sworn in and started testimony prior to this meeting. That meeting itself, while appearing improper, doesn't involve Brady obligations, but there have been reports that the witness made incriminating statements in that meeting. The witness had attempted to assert his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination during his first day of testimony. If true, the failure of the prosecution to disclose those incriminating statements would be a Brady violation. Other incidents include the prosecution referring to a detective's case file which had allegedly not been provided to the defense. Again, if true, a Brady violation. A third area of potential Brady violations includes multiple requests from the defense for law enforcement's investigatory files and videos allegedly in their possession. If the prosecution had these items, or the police did, the prosecution had an obligation to provide those items, and failure to do so would be a Brady violation. In this case, it is telling that the court did require the prosecution team to undergo additional training on their Brady obligations. In summary, in criminal prosecutions, the prosecution is under obligation to provide any information or evidence that could be exculpatory or helpful to the defendant's case, proving innocence or impacting the judgment or sentence. The court maintains a wide array of disciplinary actions where a Brady violation is found, up to and including potential mistrial with prejudice. The rest of the story with John Brady? Once the Supreme Court remanded Brady's case for determination, the lower court found that the withheld information did affect the sentence and commuted the sentence from death to life imprisonment. At a later time, John Brady was granted clemency, he moved to Florida, and he worked as a trucker. He died in 2009. Thanks for listening. There's a couple of resources that were very helpful in preparing for this quick review. First of all, the Marshall Project's article, An Odd, Almost Senseless Series of Events. It's a great quick read, and it gives you some of the same information and some additional details. Then the oyas.org website, which provides summaries, court decisions, and in many cases, oral argument recordings of Supreme Court cases. It's a great resource. Nothing in this recording should be considered legal advice. If you need legal help, please find someone in your area who's a competent attorney in the area of law you need, especially if it's criminal law. YouTube can be helpful for a lot of things, but law is very fact determinative, and so you need to speak with a licensed attorney. If this has been helpful, entertaining, or informative, please feel free to like and subscribe. A majority of Legal Graffiti's clips will be useful to law students, a tool to help memorize rule statements. But graffiti is a good term. It's like what you see painted on the wall. We're also going to focus on cases and legal concepts that are current. Have a great day. Thanks again for listening. Hope to see you again soon.